Okay, so today we're going to talk about the inverse trig functions. Before we get into them, I want to show you here I have the graph of sine. You're familiar with this. And my first question to you is this function one-to-one? And you would say no, because it does not pass the horizontal line test, right? So right now, the inverse is not a function because it does not pass the horizontal line test. It is not one-to-one. However, if we restrict the domain, so let's just focus on this part of the graph, from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, is this part of the graph, if I restrict the domain, is that one-to-one? And you would say yes. So this part of the graph is one-to-one, so it has an inverse function. So if I restrict the domain of sine to negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, then this function is one-to-one, and we can have an inverse function. This little negative 1 stands for the inverse. What is the domain and range of the inverse function? Do you remember the domain of the inverse function is equal to the range of the function, and the range of the inverse function is equal to the domain of the original function. The one piece for these problems that's going to be important to you is the range of the inverse function. All answers for inverse sine must be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. One way to think of that is from quadrant 1 to quadrant 4, right? All answers need to be between pi over 2 and negative pi over 2 for inverse sine. Okay, so we have some examples here. So the first one says find inverse sine of 1/2. So what is it asking? It's saying at which angle is sine equal to 1/2? It's the opposite of what we were doing before. It's the inverse of what we were doing before. Before, I gave you an angle, like say, what is sine of 45 degrees? And you answered square root of 2 over 2. Well, here's the opposite. I'm saying, at what angle is sine equal to 1/2? Right? Now, the one thing you have to be very careful of, since we've restricted the domain, answers need to be in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4 only. Okay, so when is sine equal to 1/2? Positive 1/2. I'll go back to my 30-60 triangle, and I will say, what is across? Ooh, I already started pointing to it. What is across from sine? 30 degrees. So sine is equal to 1/2 at 30 degrees. But we're going to answer all of ours in radians. So this is at pi over 6. What about this one? When is sine equal to negative square root of 3 over 2? Okay, well, this is where you have to be careful, the negative. What's across from square root of 3 over 2? That would be 60 degrees, otherwise known as pi over 3. However, since it's negative, it's going to be in the fourth quadrant. So again, let me just put my reference angle is pi over 3. But remember, inverse sine, your answers can only be in the first quadrant or in the fourth quadrant, the negative direction. So the answer will be negative pi over 3, negative 60. And what about this last one? When is tangent equal to 1? Oh, that's one of those quadrantal angles. The point here would be 1, 0. Sine is attached to y, so that's not it. Up here would be 0, 1. And down here is 0, negative 1. So when is sine equal to 1? When we have 90 degrees. So that would be pi over 2. So let's take a look at the inverse cosine function. Well, here I have the graph of y equals cosine x. Again, this function is not one-to-one because it does not pass the horizontal line test, so its inverse is not a function. However, if we restrict the domain, and notice we can't restrict it in the same place that we restricted sine because that still would not be one-to-one. So we're going to restrict it from 0 to pi. This chunk of the graph would be 1-to-1. So for cosine, we're going to restrict the function, the domain of the function, to be 0 to pi, and the range is still -1 to 1. So what does that mean? What about the inverse cosine function? What's its domain and range? So inverse cosine function, its domain is -1 to 1, and the range is going to be from 0 to pi. Again, this is the important piece of information you'll have to remember when doing these problems. The answers for inverse cosine function can only be between 0 and pi, which is the quadrants 1 and 2 going in the positive direction. Quadrant 1 to 2. So all answers for inverse cosine will be positive. Okay, so let's try this first one. What angle gives me cosine to be -1/2? Well, I might need my triangle. I didn't write that up here. Okay, so when is cosine equal to -1/2? Well, let me first do the reference angle. Cosine is equal to 1/2 at 60 degrees, right? So the reference angle is pi/3. However, it's negative, so all negative answers will be in the second quadrant, said in the positive direction. So what is the angle in the second quadrant with a reference angle of pi/3? 2 pi/3. What about this? At what angle is cosine equal to square root of 2/2? The reference angle is 45 degrees. And it's positive, so it's in the first quadrant, so it'll be equal to the reference angle. So that one's easy, just pi/4. And what about this last one? Again, at first we'll try to figure out what the reference angle is. When is cosine equal to square root of 3/2? That would be adjacent to 30. So the reference angle is 30 degrees, otherwise known as pi/6. So what angle in the second quadrant with a reference angle of pi/6? And you would say 5 pi/6. And that leaves us with tangent. So let's do tangent. As we can see, tangent also isn't 1 to 1, so we have to restrict its domain. So we're going to restrict its domain from these asymptotes, -pi/2 to pi/2. Notice I use parentheses because I'm not including them because they're asymptotes, and the range is -∞ to infinity. So what does that mean for the inverse function? The domain of the inverse function is -∞ to infinity, and the range would be -pi/2 to pi/2, open intervals. Again, this is the part you'll have to remember, and it's similar to the sine function. So let's try some problems. Okay, so we have the inverse tangent function of -1. So first I have to think, when is tangent equal to 1? And hopefully you have that one memorized. That's 45 degrees. However, it is negative. So we have to be careful. It's going to be in the fourth quadrant, said in the negative direction. So that would be -pi/4. What about this one? Inverse tangent square root of 3/3. Okay, I don't have this one memorized, but I know that it's either 30 or 60. So let me just play around with it. So what is tangent of 60? Tangent of 60 is opposite over adjacent, square root of 3/2 over 1/2. So that's square root of 3. So it must be the other one, but let's just verify that. Tangent of 30 is opposite over adjacent. And is it not on the board anymore? I guess not, but that'd be 1 over square root of 3, which I would then have to rationalize, so it's 30 degrees. So the reference angle is 30 degrees. It's positive, so that means it's in the first quadrant, so it's the reference angle set in the positive direction, so the answer is pi/6. So for all of these, you're going to have to be very careful of the range. Okay, so to recap, inverse sine the domain is -1 to 1, and the range is -π/2 to π/2, including those endpoints. So the way I think of it, it's to π/2, so first quadrant in the positive direction, and -π/2, the fourth quadrant in the negative direction. Inverse cosine, the range is from 0 to pi. So all answers are positive from 0 to pi, first and second quadrant. And tangent is similar to sine, except it's open intervals.